There are few games I feel as internally conflicted about as Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. The third entry in the Prime trilogy arrived in August of 2007 for the Nintendo Wii, bearing the weight of enormous and varied expectations. At the time, Corruption promised to conclude an incredible trilogy with top-tier exploration, environmental puzzles, combat, and other iconic Metroid staples. The game had to prove that the Wii motion controls could deliver or even elevate a traditional first-person shooter experience. Corruption also needed to reassure fans that the underpowered Wii hardware was still capable of delivering immersive experiences, even if it lacked the horsepower of the rival new HD consoles of the time, the PS3 and Xbox 360. With the recent release of Metroid Prime Remastered, I think it's definitely worth revisiting Corruption to analyze how core aspects of the game have held up and how they might translate to a potential remaster after so many years. A quick shout out to please hit subscribe if you enjoy this type of content. The Wii was an unusual generation of hardware, and Corruption was a fittingly unusual Metroid game. In a previous video, I explored how Prime 1 and 2 were both very ambitious games. Prime 1 delivered on the lofty goal of translating the legendary series to 3D in a first-person perspective. Prime 2 attempted to push the new formula to its limits in terms of tech and the intricacies of established Metroid design patterns. While refusing to take an easy victory lap, Retro Studios pursued yet another type of ambition with Prime 3. Beyond the already daunting challenge of overhauling the experience with motion controls, they decided to attempt a more cinematic story told across multiple different planets. Now, on the surface, Prime 3 looks like a very similar experience to its predecessors. You're still exploring alien worlds in first-person view, solving morph ball puzzles, collecting upgrades, fighting epic bosses, and enjoying those other traditional Metroid staples. However, players who actually spend a few hours behind the visor will realize that Metroid Prime 3 is a very different game from the two before it in a few significant ways. And these are differences that could potentially have a big impact on a remastered experience. Easily the biggest change in Metroid Prime 3 was the introduction of those new motion controls. Corruption did not implement a traditional dual analog setup like most shooters of the time. Instead, the game required you to aim Samus's arm cannon with the Wii Remote motion controls, and then move her character around with the nunchuck attachment's single joystick. The control setup also introduces plenty of motion-based interaction points with the world, such as pulling levers or twisting handles. It's interesting to revisit this setup in 2023 when motion controls have largely disappeared outside of virtual reality and a select few Switch experiences. In contrast, motion controls were huge in the early 2000s. The Wii was all in on motion, even introducing the Wii Motion Plus attachment for extra sensitive tracking in cases where regular motion control just wasn't enough. Sony also invested in motion control pretty heavily on the PS3 with the 6-axis and PlayStation Move controllers. Even Xbox finally jumped into the fray a few years later and delivered a full-body experience through the Kinect, using an advanced camera system to ensure no player limb was left untracked. I digress. The point is, if there was ever a time to revamp Metroid with motion controls, this was it. Now, with all of that said, I think Metroid Prime 3 actually did a really great job with these motion controls, especially for a first attempt. The general aiming and movement all feels pretty natural and doesn't constantly have calibration issues like so many motion-controlled games of the time did. Full 360-degree camera turning is a little sluggish, but it works fine in the context of this game. At the time, I thought this was actually a pretty cool experience and that it was superior to the GameCube controls, which did not allow you to look around freely. However, I still prefer traditional dual analog controls over motion aiming. For example, I still played Metroid Prime Remastered with the default dual analog setup rather than reverting to the retrofitted motion aiming. I should probably also add a disclaimer here that, personally, I usually do not like motion controls in games in general. So the fact that I genuinely enjoyed the motion controls of the Prime series is a real testament to Retro's design abilities. Now, although I think Retro did a great job with motion controls, I do think those controls present a significant challenge for a remaster of this game. There is such an abundance of motion-based interactions with the world in Prime 3 that I'm not sure how they would translate all of this to a dual analog setup on the Switch. and dual analog support is basically required for handheld mode or the Switch Lite. There are countless levers, switches, consoles, keypads, grapple surfaces, and enemy interactions all designed around motion controls. I always felt like many of these were harmless but somewhat gimmicky or tedious interactions, despite my appreciation for the core motion aiming mechanics. Ironically, when they retrofitted motion controls back onto Prime 1 and 2, I thought those games actually felt better with the Wii Remote than Prime 3, which was specifically designed for it. That's because all of those tedious world interactions are gone, leaving only the nice core aiming setup. I'm curious to see how these moments would be handled in a remaster. Retro could try to remap motions to the joysticks and buttons, similar to what Skyward Sword HD accomplished, with mixed success. They could also potentially just swap the interactivity with button inputs that simply trigger the desired end state of each of those interactions. However, these options raise questions of whether those interactions would still support motion input if the player did select the original motion controls option for the game. It seems like a lot of work for the developer to enable multiple different interactions with so many pieces of the world based on your selected control scheme, but I'm sure it's possible. Again, we sort of saw this with Skyward Sword, even if those are two very different games with different camera perspectives. This challenge also extends to the combat. Samus makes extensive use of the grapple lasso to yank shields off of enemies, pull on armor, tear pieces off of creatures, and so on. The combat motion works well because these interactions are kept simple but effective. Would Retro simply remap those lasso actions to a button? Would that work and feel natural? The motion controls are so woven into this game, it's hard to imagine every single action remapped to buttons. Combat is generally a bigger focus of this game than in past Primes, so it's interesting to think about how it would translate or feel with standard dual analog controls. Another ambitious and divisive change to Prime 3 was the greatly increased emphasis on story and cinematics. Corruption features many story cutscenes with voice acting and selective facial animation, which was new for the Prime series.
Before I begin the briefing, let me introduce 242, the flagship's Aurora unit.
The first hour or two of this game in particular spends a significant amount of time focusing on Samus's interactions with the Galactic Federation and a few other bounty hunters. It's an interesting change that expands the game universe quite a bit. Samus remains a silent protagonist and does not speak in Corruption, which for the most part works fine with how these scenes are arranged. As you get further into the game, the number of cutscenes does decrease in favor of more exploration until the grand finale, but the game never fully recreates the isolation of its predecessors. Now, although I think that for the most part these cutscenes generally get the job done, I was honestly never really a huge fan of the way the story is presented, even back in 2007. I think this is due to a combination of personal preferences for Metroid storytelling and some rough edges due to the technical limitations of the hardware. The Wii was only marginally more powerful than the GameCube, and it shows. Characters and animations were already dated at the time, with low detail models and unnatural or limited facial animations that have not aged very well. If we look at some examples here, most of the character interactions and animations are pretty stiff and look older than 2007. The presentation just feels a little bit overly ambitious for the hardware. Now, the overall scope of this game is still very impressive for a Wii game. However, I just don't think time has been quite as kind to the presentation decisions of Prime 3 as the two games before it. Remember, 2007 was a juggernaut year for cinematic gaming. Titles like Uncharted Drake's Fortune, Halo 3, Modern Warfare, Mass Effect, Ratchet & Clank Tools of Destruction, they all released in this year and feature impressive cinematic storytelling for the time. It feels like Retro was going for something along those lines, maybe not quite to the extent of those other games, but just lacked the hardware resources to fully realize that vision. The first hour or two of this game in particular is very linear and constantly interrupted by these in-game cinematics, which creates a questionable first impression in 2023. The pacing implies the game will play more like a standard first-person shooter than a traditional Metroid game. In my opinion, the game continuously gets better as you progress further, and some of these rough presentation elements take a back seat. Although Prime 3 is fairly linear for a Metroid game, the beginning hours still are not a great representation of the overall experience. Now, the reason I'm a little bit hard on these cutscenes is that it's difficult for me to imagine how they could be smoothly upgraded to the same graphical standards we saw in the Metroid Prime Remaster without significant rework. Simply replacing the character models with more detailed versions may not service the game very well. Scenes might look even more unnatural and stiff with more realistic models and textures if other enhancements aren't included as well, such as revamped animations. One of the reasons Metroid Prime Remastered works so well is that the vast majority of the game is purely world environments and alien creature designs. There aren't really any human interaction cutscenes or any expressive story beats that needed a major upgrade, which means most of the original animations could stay in place. The story and emotion is drawn from the world itself. The Prime 1 remaster does feature one limited glimpse of a human face, which looks fine, but it's hard to picture how that would scale out to this much bigger story experience. Prime 3 is just a completely different animal in terms of storytelling. Corruption also features 3 other bounty hunters with their own abilities and personalities. I mostly enjoyed this aspect of the game and how they factor in for some interesting boss fights and story moments. However, I do think their character models and animations would require a fair amount of updating to look natural in higher fidelity graphics. The bounty hunter named Gore in particular looks pretty rough in this game. He also rides around in a giant mech suit that has plenty of strange animations and movements. Rundus and Gandreda have stronger designs and more natural interactions and could probably be upgraded without as many issues. I'm excited to see what they could look like in a remaster. Metroid Prime 3 occasionally features some surprisingly low detail character and creature models in general, even compared to its predecessors on weaker hardware. For example, I think stylistically, Umos looks much better in Prime 2 than some of the characters in Prime 3. Some of the space pirates also have stronger designs and more definition to them in the older games. The pirates in Prime 3 have sort of a thin, gangly design a lot of the time that doesn't always include a lot of detail. Now, if Retro actually were able to put in a fair amount of work to overhaul these character and cutscene assets, I think it would be really interesting to see how Metroid would feel with that sort of story-driven experience in 2023. If they're willing to go all in on this, I would fully support it. I just think it would be a shame to see this game re-released with rough or awkward cinematics. The overall graphics and visual presentation of Prime 3 beyond the story also present an interesting opportunity for a remaster. The visuals of this game feature some truly standout moments, but also a few low points for the series. Corruption is generally a very good-looking Wii game, but I think it's also probably the most uneven entry in the series in terms of its art design and world immersion. That's a bit strange considering it was built for more powerful hardware with a very seasoned team at this point. Some aspects of Corruption's presentation feel a little bit rushed or underdeveloped. Unlike Prime 1 and 2, Corruption features 6 or 7 different planets and notable locations. While I love the variety here and the idea of traveling between these worlds, I also think this caused the team's time and design resources to be stretched a little thin. Some of these locations look amazing, while others do not feel nearly as intricately crafted as the fascinating worlds of Talon 4 or Aether from the first 2 games. I'm sure a lot of development resources were also consumed by the motion controls and cinematics as well, further reducing the amount of time spent on the environments. Some worlds really do look fantastic and showcase Retro's talent. I'd love to see how a remaster could elevate them further. My favorite planet in the game is easily Elysia, which hosts a stunning city in the sky connected between rails and trams. It's one of my favorite Metroid environments of all time. This cloudy planet features impressive scope and all kinds of interesting robotic enemies and elegant industrial systems. I love the almost steampunk vibe of this area and the flair of beauty added to all of the different machinery. This could all be elevated further with higher quality textures and lighting in a remaster. This area could also really benefit from an increase in resolution due to the long draw distance and large models in the outdoor areas. Prime 3 has an ambitious scope but can really start to look grainy at 480p resolution in such large environments. On the other hand, planets like Norion and some parts of Brio feel very bland to me. The background scenery is sometimes blurry and generic. And if we take a look at some of these corridor designs in particular, they lack the overall level of detail or thoughtfulness of the areas we would see in Metroid Prime 1 and 2. In my opinion, none of the compounds or corridors of Norion look as interesting as those found in the previous games, such as the fascinating designs of the Sanctuary Fortress or the moody labs of the Phendrana Drifts. Rooms are often just kind of rectangular or square-shaped with flat surfaces and textures, which isn't really something we saw in the previous two games. This same design standard also applies to the Federation ships, even if you do only spend a little bit of time on them throughout the game. The environments look alright, but they don't feel all that lived in or well thought out beyond hallways for combat and walking. I'm curious to see if a remaster could extract significantly more geometric detail and add more interesting textures to give these environments more personality. I think the overall lighting design of this game also delivers some highs and lows. For better or worse, everything in this game looks like it has some sort of soft global bloom lighting applied to it. Many surfaces have sort of a strange glow to them, even where there are no light sources. I feel like this greatly limits the amount of contrast or dynamic lighting the game is able to create, and gives everything a bit of a blurry appearance. In beautiful environments like Elysia, where details are more plentiful and environments are more dramatic, I think this lighting system actually works really well and creates some memorable sets. Some of these areas look really impressive for the Wii hardware. On the other hand, in emptier environments like Norion, I think the lighting system fails to add life and just makes the lack of detail more noticeable. I think it would be an interesting challenge to maintain the original look of the game while upgrading it with higher quality lighting. A potential remaster should also address the loading times in this game. Corruption is the worst offender out of the three games in terms of loading. Switching between planets requires several loading screens and menus and just takes forever. After returning to her ship, Samus first has to ride a lift up into the ship and transition to the cockpit. You then have to select which planet you're going to, and then which subsection of that planet, and then a cutscene plays of Samus taking off from the world. Then a cutscene plays of her traveling through space, and then a cutscene plays of her landing on the planet, and another one shows her getting out of her ship. This overall process is a major pain, and unedited takes about a minute from start to finish. It's much worse than the elevator rides in the other two games. I know a lot of games that have some major world hopping like this have this problem, but I wish it could be improved somehow. The entire sequence also plays out if you're just switching to a different section of the same planet. The different parts of the planet are often only reachable by ship, which means you're watching these transitions over and over. Later in the game, when you're world hopping around looking for final power-ups and finishing off the main storyline, this process becomes a big pain. I'm hoping Retro can at least reduce the number of transition cutscenes you have to watch to improve immersion and reduce waiting. Corruption is also the worst offender of the three games when it comes to hiding small loading times behind slow-to-open doors. There are sections of this game where it feels like almost every door makes you wait for a long time to open, sometimes as long as 5 seconds or more. This may not sound that bad, but when you're constantly moving between rooms and a high percentage of them have a brief loading time to open, it can grow annoying. The slow door load times were fixed in the Metroid Prime Remaster, so they can probably be addressed here as well. Now, I know it might sound like I'm being a bit hard on Metroid Prime 3, but that's partially because the discussion here is focused on a remaster. We're looking for areas that could use improvement or just be elevated to a new level. There are many parts of Corruption I really enjoyed that wouldn't really be impacted either way by a remaster. For example, I like that you don't lose all of your abilities at the beginning of the game, and there are still interesting new power-ups to experiment with beyond that. The combat feels tactile and is probably the best in the series. I appreciate the way Samus's ship is integrated into the gameplay and creates some interesting scenarios like assembling a giant bomb on Elysia. Despite my gripes about the story presentation, I do like the way the story ties certain themes and strands of the trilogy into a more cohesive narrative. So the real question here is whether or not a remaster could significantly elevate the experience and fix some of the game's core issues we've discussed. We could see more detailed and polished worlds, reduced load times, more control options, revamped lighting, and more polish on some rushed components. However, some aspects of Prime 3's design probably wouldn't be improved by a straightforward graphical overhaul. I think some planets would still feel a little bit overly simplistic and segmented or linear. I don't think all of the cinematics and story beats would translate well to higher fidelity graphics unless significant rework was applied. And I think certain aspects of combat and various world interactions might feel odd if the motion controls are either removed or made optional. And so at the end of the day, I think it just depends on what type of remaster we get. The rumored simple up-resed port to the Switch would be serviceable, but I think newcomers or players who haven't visited the game in a long time might be surprised by the number of rough edges that haven't aged well. I don't think a simple new coat of paint could fix most of the aging issues with this game like it did for Prime 1 and probably could for most of Prime 2. I think Corruption would require the most work out of the three to recapture the magic of 2007, when gamers were more forgiving of some of these shortcomings and more excited about its new strengths like motion controls. However, if Retro were to dig deep and really put a lot of effort into overhauling this game, I think it has some huge potential to really become something special. Prime 3 could definitely deliver an epic conclusion to a fantastic trilogy with the right approach and level of investment. Put differently, I think Prime 3 should either come as a simple up-resed port with all the rough edges and managed expectations, or receive a significant remaster investment to really address various issues and elevate its strengths. I don't think a lighter remaster or in-between solution would fare very well. So what do you think? How has this game aged for you? And what changes would you like to see made? Leave a comment with your thoughts below, and please hit subscribe if you enjoyed this video.